So as some of you may know, Sarah and I are getting married in 3 weeks, and so I'm supposed to be on some kind of a diet. And so when I hear this profound and beautiful passage on the bread of life, I think, I love eating bread. And I sat there for a while with that thought and that thought alone. Bread is delicious. But what does Jesus mean? And to be honest, that sentiment itself is really, it would have been at the heart of the people that Jesus spoke to far more profoundly than us, right? I mean, this is a group of people. There was no industrial food industry. People were reliant on the land in a climate that was not particularly kind to lots of people being on it. And when Jesus is saying to a group of these people, I am the bread of life, they might be thinking, that's great, but we are all deeply hungry and we need something to eat, right? So right from the very beginning, there is a real challenge to this passage. These are words that are spoken to very hungry people. And bread meant a lot more, I think, in a lot of ways in the ancient world than it may for us. It means different things to us now and with all this low-carb stuff. But in the ancient world, bread was an enormously powerful symbol. Bread was where you got most of your calories for most people. That's really what most people ate. For a lot of people, maybe 50% of all the calories eaten. People had an average of about 1,200 calories a day in the ancient world. It's recommended for a healthy person today, we eat about 2,000 calories. So when we look at about 1,200 calories, we're looking at the caloric intake of a lot of what we would describe to be very impoverished countries. That's really at the height of the Roman Empire, when great civilization reigned. Most people had about 1,200 calories a day. And about half of those calories were from bread. Another big chunk was from wine. That's why the Eucharist is bread and wine. It's not supposed to be a fancy feast. It's supposed to be the humble meal of someone who is at the very bottom rung of society. They would have some very vinegary wine that probably didn't taste very good, but had a lot of calories in it, and bread, and then the rest they probably were able to find. If figs were in season, they might have some figs, some nuts, some different things that they would find. If you had a lot of wealth, you could eat meat, and that was fantastic. If you were a Roman soldier, you ate a lot of bacon, apparently. But for most people, it was mostly bread. And it was deeply political. You might have heard the term bread and circuses. That's because the Roman politicians, to get elected, would give the people bread. And a lot of people, that was what they lived on that day, was bread that came from the government. Bread and circuses, right? They kept the people entertained and kept the people fed. It was very political. You ruled with great power if you could produce bread for the people. Remember that temptation that Satan gives Jesus, make these stones into bread. It's not the temptation that Jesus might have an unlimited amount of food in the desert. It's that he might take on the kind of power that Rome had, the great Roman Empire. Bread was used to conquer. Bread was used to rule people, especially to rule the poor. And if you've been hungry for any length of time, bread would have been, for those people, the first thing they thought about in the morning and the last thing they thought about when they went to sleep. There's a story that my father tells that he heard from someone who survived the Battle of Britain, and they had trouble getting the kids to go to sleep until they gave every child a loaf of bread. And then they could get to sleep because they knew they'd have food in the morning. Bread was also the center of family. There's this is a hospitality culture, right? I mean, this is a culture in a very inhospitable climate and world where if someone comes to your door, it doesn't matter who they are, and this is throughout the Old and New Testament. If someone comes to your door and you have no clue who they are, you are obligated to invite them in and make sure that they are well fed and taken care of. That is about as biblical as you can get. And the one exception when you can wait, when they have to wait outside your door, was when you're breaking bread together as a family. And that moment, that's a sacred moment. It's a special time. We're breaking bread together, and you finish breaking bread, and then you can invite the stranger to come in. Bread was sacred. It was powerful. It was at the center of our life as a family and community. And for many, many people in the ancient world, it was the first thing that we thought about when we woke up in the morning and the last thing that we thought about when we went to bed that night. And it's into that world that Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Jesus is saying, when you go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning, the first thing in your mind should be God, the incarnate Word of God, the living bread of life, that God should be at the center of our family and community, at the center of our politics, the chief power in this world, that which we should hunger and thirst for. It's a very powerful statement that Jesus is making. And it is a life and death kind of thing. And since this is coming from the Gospel of John, a gospel that calls us to love one another as Jesus loved us, and the tradition of John, the first letter of John says, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Perhaps we might interpret this to say we should hunger and thirst for the love of God. What might it look like for the love of God to be at the center of our families and our relationships? For the love of God to be at the center of our minds when we wake up in the morning and we go to bed at night, a deep hunger and a thirst. The psalmist so much talks about hungering and thirsting for God. We hear it from the prophets. What might it be like for our politics to be at the very center of the love of God? Many, many Christians took the words of Jesus, these words, very seriously. When we think about bread being really a life and death thing, many Christians see the love of God the same way. We've all heard of the great Christian martyrs, placing the love of God before their own lives. We all can comprehend the love that mothers and fathers have for their kids, a love that would transcend their own lives. It's more important that my kids be fed than I be fed. We can think of the great leaders of ages past and hopefully in our own age, where they would give their own lives for the cause of justice and peace, rather than to see injustice be done. There are instances in our world where this very natural and elemental hunger for bread, something that for most of us would replace anything. I think for a lot of us, certainly including myself, if I was to go hungry for several days, maybe even weeks, where I start to go mad thinking about bread and finding a meal somewhere, anywhere, for Jesus to say to me, there's something more important and more central in your life than that hunger that has been haunting you all week, and that is your love for God. To think about that kind of power, and to think that people died for that love, that was the center of their world and their being. That is an enormously powerful thing that Jesus is saying to us, and we have martyrs and saints and people probably in our own lives that we've encountered who have put the love of God before their own lives, their own hunger, their own central needs, that a lot of us would see as inalienable rights that we must protect at all costs. There are people that would put their love for God and for one another, for not just their families, but for their communities and their neighbors, and even for people that they despise. There are people that put that love before their own hunger, their own thirst, their own lives. I believe that that's what Jesus is saying when he's saying, I am the bread of life. that our love for God and for each other must transcend even our most basic and essential needs if we are to follow God and transform our world and our lives. Amen.